All right, welcome back. So this is podcast number two, and in my last podcast we talked about um, why what are the studies of American literature, why we study them, and pretty much like going into depth about that. This episode is going to be about American customs, and specifically, what do we learn from American customs, and how do we engage with surveyors? And so this is not part one, but this is side one, because my second part to answering this question and talking about this topic is going to be in an article that I write up, that you'll see in another thing on my website. But for this one, I am going to be talking about Deloria, um, and how he was someone who was basically a surveyor who talked a lot about American customs as someone who lived in the U.S., but was not, your traditional European descent, white, Caucasian male. He was someone who was Indian and who lived on the reservations, and had, a hard bring up. And so he was someone that I think uh, challenged a lot of things, especially, being born during the Depression era. I apologize, and even just talking a lot about the Civil Rights Movement and um, just other things in his "We Talk, You Listen" book. He tackles a lot of these things, and um, yeah, and so he's someone that I think represents the marginalized communities very well and very accurately. And so yeah, and then in my other part, you're going to hear about James Baldwin, and how he was also writing about the same type of time era. I apologize, sorry. The same type of time era, but how his was just a different perspective. And so I talk about both men's perspectives. But today we are going to talk about Vine Deloria. And so um, I'm just jumping in. And so basically, as we learn about Vine Deloria Jr., he's someone who, is a very, very, very big advocate. I've seen interviews and I've read books, and, I've read a lot about him. And he's just basically someone who takes his advocacy very seriously, which is really important, I think, when talking about a lot of American customs and even just, going back to the challenging of ideals and stuff. And so, yeah, he was born, like I mentioned, during the Depression era, March 26th of 1933, and so he was actually born in one of the poorest parts of the nation in Martin, South Dakota, near Pine Ridge, Oglala Sioux. Um, and so, yeah, his father and a lot of his family went into Christian theology, but he, just wasn't. I guess he was, but then decided to take a change of route with just studying regular theology, and so something something that I really liked about when I studied Divine Deloria Jr. is he's someone who takes his ideas of tribalism very seriously, and that was something that he put forth a lot when it came to what the American life should look like, and how it can change, how it can benefit. And so um, something I quoted from an article that was written about him. It says, and I quote, "Technology and corporate values were destroying American life," and he, which is Deloria, urged a return to the tribal standards of Indian culture as a window to salvation. And so. A lot of his beliefs, a lot of his concepts, a lot of his, uh, motivations towards this American life fell between Indian culture, and how tribal standards were something that were, a way that people could come together and be one, and not have to be separate from one another. And I think I think where I saw this was like I felt like it was even like a solution to a problem, like who uh he was someone who I think like had hope for America and even like the people around him. I think he saw a problem and was like, "Hey, let me fix it with this idea." And um, not to say that he was super against it, but I think a lot of the surveyors that we read about, I think go and try to find a solution. I apologize. I yawned, but I think a lot of these people, attempt to find solutions, which is great. I think there's a need to find better in these areas, which is great. And so um, going into his book, We Talk, You Listen, it was such a great book, such a good book. This book takes place before the 1970s, around the civil rights movement time. Um, Deloria really interprets this idea of American Indian tribalism and how there was a need for Indian solution to happen right along with other movements that were being advocated. And um, this was interesting. This was challenging. This was different. This was like, man, why are you where there's already something going on in another movement? Why are you trying to add something? But I think going back to the topic of representing marginalized communities, I think Brian Deloria was representing his own marginalized community. He wasn't saying there was anything wrong with the civil rights movement. I think he tackles the idea of, leadership, power, and, how he even like talks about like how certain groups didn't have to be made, how there was like, man, like why do you have to do this when like I don't know. He talks about like the Black Panther group, and he's like, man, like, why do we have to do this? Like, there should be no reason for that. And um, giving the power to a group who's already marginalized gives them an elite power that just doesn't need to be handed to them. And so that was a little tricky when reading, because I think there was a response to his that we had read in class. Not not discrediting his uh his work, but kind of just questioning it, like, man, like, kind of how I've questioned a lot of the people's writings, but he questions it and says, man, like, why are you challenging something that's already being talked about? And so that's where controversial steps in on his marginalized community that he talks about. And he goes into depth about power and culture, specifically with like how certain power was given to certain groups during this time. And he asks why aren't the Indian people being represented in this way? Why can't there be more than just one? Why can't there be more than just one group, being talked about in this way? Why can't they all just like, move in unison? Why can't we all just help one another? And he keeps this question all throughout like his book. And so he was someone who focused on this feeling of loss, I guess, and he has an urgency for activism with other minority groups, and that he says that it shouldn't just focus on one; that it should focus on multiple. And he mentions again his tribal context, that's something that he thinks is going to be best for everyone, and so he challenges the white audience and how. Um, he challenges the white audience and how things aren't just black and white, but white and everyone else. And he encourages his readers to not take a linear viewpoint of the world, as stated in his book. And so it's basically he's like not he doesn't like the term black or white, because at the end of the day there's black and white and all in between. It's like, man, there's a lot going on in between. Like, that's what should be talked about. And um I think that's why his work becomes so intriguing, because he doesn't just focus on two narratives, he focuses on one and everybody else. It's like, give everyone else the voice, give everyone else the chance. And so it even questions me, like, is he I guess the question I ask about representing marginalized communities is like, man, he's not even just focusing on one. He obviously like does talk a lot about his main, community, but I think um his question gets challenged in a response that we had read in class about how he basically says like, you say white and everyone else, but then you only talk about your community. But I think his point to doing that was just spreading awareness on his specific community, and how there was only an attention center during the civil rights movement to African Americans at the time receiving rights, which is obviously a huge turnaround in our society, and even in history. It was such a huge thing, but I think Delora really wanted it to be not just one group being like talked about in that area. um, and so, yeah, I think Delora is one of someone who I think tackles this very well. And he basically just says that we shouldn't be pinning minorities against one another, that it shouldn't be a multitude of ideas. And so David Martinez is the one who responds to him. I just found the name, I apologize. So yeah, he's the one who does the response to him and saying how in his Not Your Minority chapter, he covers the concept by Deloria and the tribalism sense during the civil rights movement. And he basically says that yes, there's a need for things to be changed, but he saw that Deloria was only focusing on Southern tribes rather than any connection to the Black civil rights leaders, like he preached about in his book. And so I think that's a response, but as someone who talks about American customs and how, you know, it's all very fluctuated, it's all very different, it's all very, something. I think he challenges his American customs and goes, hey, like, we should be moving in a tribalistic way. Let's all, like, be as one. Let's all work as we do on the reservation. Let's all, he tries to find a solution, which I love that. um, but I think too, when it comes to being someone who represents the marginalized communities and um, those who are in center of power and culture and privilege, I think um, Delora does that well. He talks about it well. He yeah, he challenges those ideas in a great way in his book We Talk You Listen. And um, yeah, I think I'm also going to be talking about James Baldwin, who is also during this time period and talks a lot about that same thing. But yes, and this is the ending to my spiel about that. And so, yes, I believe Vanderlota is someone who is a surveyor who isn't like most people, and but I just think he's someone who really wanted to tackle a lot of problems within his own community, and how there should have been help. Um, but yeah, so that is the end, and thank you so much for listening. And this is the end of the podcasts. And I hope that you enjoy reading my articles and seeing what I have on social media. Thank you so much. Bye bye.